Good morning. We are summarizing and reviewing the conclusion of Ayin Beis, and we are on page 1364. Discussing Ohr Mekabel, which is essentially in the higher worlds, in the spheres, is called the level of Malchus. And it captures, personifies the very essence of another entity, not a mashpia, like Zah, the sun, which transmits, but one that's in a state of receptivity. But we understand the receptivity is not just a passive state, it's a very active state. Both the act of emptying yourself, like we learned Kabbalah soil, emptying yourself and be an empty container to receive that which is greater than you. And also the very fact that Malchus is captures the concept, therefore, of bittul, and also that Malchus is, as we learned, all aspects of it, both as it receives the energies from above and it's triggered and I use different words for this, stimulated from the Aveda below. So Malchus, in that sense, becomes the interface that will serve as both an entity that doesn't have anything of its own, but at the same time will manifest everything. So when we do the proper Aveda and all the levels of the work, then Malchus will elevate, not just to the level of Zah, but all the way to the level of the Helam Atzmi and to Atzmus, because that's the ultimate kavanah, Seif Ma'aseh Machshava Tchila, that in this world, we, initially beginning as a recipient, should ultimately have a complete relationship with God, who's the ultimate mashpia, Mekabel, the ultimate mashpia, and that we actually increase something, so to speak, even in the levels of the divine pleasure, which is to fulfill the desire that there should be a dira b'tachtein. The last piece we learned, just to sum up what we learned, and then the introduction to the next section, which we're going to learn now, is that even the Aveda Mamata Lamaila, which is the thing that triggers and stimulates Malchus, even that comes from Chesed Elyon. That was the last piece we learned, from the Chesed. Because the fact is that unlike a king, a physical king, a human king, and the subjects, God is not separate. We're not separate from God. We're all an extension. And secondly, why would our Avodah matter to him? So that's why he said, that's why we need Chesed Elyon, that our Avodah should matter, that God chooses, that's his kindness to us, and that we have the possibility to stimulate, to arouse, to awaken the Izgalus, the revelation of his kingship, which is what Adam and every human being does all the time, especially Rosh Hashanah, as we learned. Okay, so that's a summary of the Ohr Mekabel that in the overall terms. Then we go now into in this itself, there are three levels. And these three levels, as I explained yesterday, are actually three stages, you can say, in how the Mekabel develops a relationship with the Mashpia, how the recipient develops a relationship with that Ohr that it receives. Ultimately, the main focus is going to be on Ohr Hariyah, power to see. That on one hand, we need an outside light to receive from as a siyua, to support so the eye can see. On the other hand, the eye itself sees. But to appreciate that, we need to go through the two other examples for Ohr Mekabel, two other levels, namely the Levana and the luminous stone. That's what we're going to learn now. And then we're going to apply that to 3 levels in Torah, Mikra, Mishna, Talmud. And then he's going to get back to the central theme of Mekabel and Mashpia as we've been learning. So this right now is not a digression, it's not a tangent. It's all part of the discussion. The Rebbe Rashab is just weaving it all together. So he's going to bring Torah into the picture. And we know Torah is a critical piece because on page 1350, he started speaking about Torah, that Torah is Mamshech Mamayl Lamata, that interface of the divine to existence. Torah is Amshach Mamayl Lamata from Ayin to Yesh. So Torah is connected here, but the way the Rebbe Rashab is doing, instead of talking further about Ohr Mekabel, he's going to say a few words about it, then he's going to go into Torah, and then we're going to go back to it. So we'll see how the ideas develop, and we'll continue learning it and the context of the whole flow that is now informed by the Maimorim we learned from the Alter Rebbe and the Mittler Rebbe. Okay. So the new paragraph on page 1364, and if you want to follow the text, you can go to ayinbeis.com and find it there. What was the other word I used? Omnom, yesh bezeh gimel madreges. In this level of Malchus, which is Ohr Mekabel be'etzem, like he just read, we just learned the line before, there are 3 levels. The Hein al derech moshel, and they're like, for example, the Ohr haLevana, the light of the moonlight, Ohr ha'even teiv, the light of a luminous stone, Ve'ohr riyas ha'ayin, and the light of vision, of eyesight. As we learned when we began this topic, a few pages back, 10 pages back, and this continues to be based on the Maimer, new Maimer, another Maimer, Ve'inenu me'ires, from the Mittler Rebbe, based on the Alter Rebbe's Maimer, which I've mentioned a number of times. Ve'isa b'ksavim, and we find in writings, the writings is the Mittler Rebbe's Maimer that I'm referring to. That was not published, but I posted a copy of that Maimer on the group. So you can see it there, there's 2 versions of it, one shorter, one longer. So what is it saying, Ksavim? It says, Shein begimel elam is biyah, that these three examples of light, of Ohr Mekabel, are in the 3 worlds of biyah. In Biyah itself, the Malchus of each level of Biyah. So till now, we've been learning about Malchus in general terms, Malchus of Atzilus. That's Ohr Mekabel. Now he's breaking it down that this corresponds to the 3 worlds of Biyah. The Malchus de Beriya, the Malchus of Beriya, he kamoi b'chinas Levana. That's like the moon. Or Malchus de Yetzira, of the world of Yetzira, who kamoi b'chinas Even, is like the stone, like the luminous stone. And the Malchus of the world of Asiya is like the eye, the eyesight. So these 3 examples that we study and understand and evaluate are helping us understand 3 levels of Malchus, Beriya, Yetzira, Asiya, in that order. The Nod Seifim B'tchilasan, and the end is wedged in the beginning, because the whole kavanah is that it should come down all the way to the lowest level. Malchus Asiya, and this lowest level, Malchus of Asiya, which corresponds to eyesight, it contains a reflection or a light, a very, very, very higher and much higher level than even Malchus of Beriya. So even though Malchus of Beriya is a higher level than Malchus of Yetzira, but since Malchus of Yetzira is the purpose of it all, it in turn has something that is even higher even than Malchus of Beriya. This we will understand later as we learn further this idea. I already explained it because essentially the kavanah is not that we should just have a moon that reflects the sun and shines at night, but we want the eye, we want the Mekabel to see with its own very eyes. The moon never really is not an eye. The moon is not a seeing entity. Whereas the Mekabel called the eyesight is a seeing entity. Yes, it needs an external light, and the moon shines once it receives that light, whereas the eye does not, as we learned. But the ultimate goal is that the eye should see with its own very power, as we shall learn. So right now he established that these three levels correspond to the three levels of Malchus of Beriya, Yetzira, Asiya. And point number two is that the end is wedged in the beginning. So the Malchus of Asiya, Riya, has something that is higher, what he calls Ha'or Hagavoya, Ma'ed Naila, very Hagavoya, Ma'ed Naila Mebchinas Malchus de Beriya. A very exalted, very high level, greater than Malchus of Beriya. Okay, now a few more lines to explain what's the difference between the three. B'nizbar le'il, and we learned earlier, around 12 pages back, on page 1352 and on, ha'hefresh beinayim, the difference between these three levels of Ohr Mekabel, of the light of the recipient. The levana hi b'chinas moyer. The moon is a level of a moyer. It's a luminary. Like the Torah tells us that God created and placed two luminaries in heaven, one to shine by day and one to shine by night. So the moon is called a moyer. However, what type of moyer it is, it's not like the sun. It's a different type. It's an Ohr Mekabel. It does not shine on its own. Only after it received the light of the sun, that gets darkened in the moon, because obviously the moon is not as intense as the sun. So the sunlight enters and is absorbed by the moon and gets darkened there. And it gets transformed according to the muhus of the moon. And we learned there are two approaches, whether this is actually the sunlight as it shines through the moon, or is it moonlight as well? We said both are true, but here clearly he's saying, so the sun, so-called, gets filtered through the filter of the moon, and that's when it shines. So it's a moyer, but it's a moyer, unlike the mashpia of the sun, it's a moyer that requires another light to trigger and get its light going. Its own light or the sunlight, however you explain it, but bottom line, it needs something else for it to shine at night. And if you don't have the sun, it wouldn't shine. That's the moyer. That's the levana, the first one. Ha'evan ha'toiv, the luminous stone, who she'en ha'cheshech machshech halav. The luminous stone, we learned, does not illuminate the night. The moon, you actually can walk. When the moon is shining, you can follow it. It's not as bright and as clear as like sunlight and daylight, but you can. The luminous stone shines, but it does not illuminate. So with the luminous stone, you could say the darkness does not darken it. Everything, when the sun sets, everything gets dark. A luminous stone has properties that retains the light. And therefore it also shines. I mean, you could Meir Sacheshech means it is illuminated, it illuminates the dark. This is the Ohr that was absorbed in it, that it acquired. The light of the sun or the light of the stars. But you don't call it a moyer. You don't call it a luminary. So it has light within it, and the darkness does not conceal it. So if you walk, that's in a dark forest, everything will be dark, but the luminous stones will glow. Ayin, the third level. So the first two is Malchus, the Beriya, Malchus of Yetzira, now Malchus of Asiya, the Ayin, the eye, Hu she'ena Ohr Hameir. The eye does not shine at all. That's why in a dark room, you don't see light coming out of the eyes, as opposed to the moon that shines and the stone that glows. So there's no Ohr Hameir at all. But Tzarich Siyua, Ohr Hameir, it needs support, it needs help from an Ohr Hameir, from another entity that's shining, a light that does shine, but and that's when the eye can see. So it's a Mekabel because it requires that light. But the eye itself sees. The first two, at the end of the day, even if they retain light, it's not their own light. It's the light of the sun. At least even the second opinion, second aspect of the moonlight, that it's its own light, but it's not shining light. The shining is coming from the sun. Same thing with the luminous stone. Whereas the eye, because the eye has a power to see. That's why that very light is not going to make your ear see. And on the other hand, the light is not what sees. The light just shines that allows the eye to see. But it's the eye itself that sees. And that is the third level of what he called Malchus of Asiya. Like we learned earlier, that the places that we also call it a moir, like a luminary, the luminary of the eyes. I'm going to learn more the difference between that and the moon, but it does have an element of that because the eye itself is a seeing eye. So this is a summary of the three types of Ohr Mekabel. We're going to get back to this in a while. It's going to take a while till we get back to it. I'll tell you where we get back to it. In 12 pages. On page 1386, he's going to return to this. But now, he's going to explain all of this through Torah, through three levels of Torah, Mikra, Mishna, Talmud, which will help us understand these three levels of Ohr Mekabel, Malchus of Beriya, Malchus of Yetzira, Malchus of Asiya, which correspond to the examples of the moon, the luminous stone, and the eye, and vision, the eyesight. So let me stop if anybody wants to ask anything about what we just summed up, and then we'll continue learning. Any questions?
Just to clarify, he says that the stone doesn't hold any light of its own, right? It just is able to light or to give a color or a light during the time that the sun or the stars are shining on it, right?
No, it retains it even when the sun is not shining and the stars are not shining. It has properties like we see. There are objects that once you see some of these rechargeable lights, or things like when the sun is by day, the
like
sun,
they glow in the dark.
Yes.
They glow in the dark. Yeah, these are stones that glow in the dark. That's what he's saying.
But then they run out, right?
I don't know. That's already a question of, I guess, different types. There are stones that probably retain it, maybe, or maybe once the day comes, the stone renews and gets recharged by the sun. I'm not sure how it works scientifically, to be honest. He doesn't talk about that there. But it's a form of Ohr Mekabel. Now, if you want to see more details in the Mimer, he talked about it earlier on page 1352 and 1353. Were you here when we learned it there?
I don't think so. I'll go back.
So go back, because there he spelled it out in more detail. To be exact, I think it's not 1352, I'm sorry. The stone is on 1353. Yeah, he speaks about it in more detail.
Okay.
There's a little, I don't know if it's an inconsistency. There he said clearly, Um, that it glows, that's for sure that it glows. The question if it also illuminates, there he said it doesn't illuminate. Here he did say the words, Umer gamken asacheshech. So I'm assuming he means that it's not like the moon, quite like the moon, but it's still, I guess, in the vicinity of that stone. If the glow is strong enough, you could see a little. So I think that's what he means. But it's not like the moon. So back on page 1353, he explains more in detail. Yeah. And above all, we're gonna learn later what it means beruchnius, spiritually. At the end of the day, this is all examples, physical examples to help us understand different levels of how we receive light. Like I pointed out a number of times, this whole discussion, keep in mind, think of like an infant. A newborn child is only a Mekabel. And as a child gets educated, a child learns from its surroundings, that it's starting to absorb light. Light meaning intelligence, awareness, experiences. So essentially, in Avedic language, the Ohr Mekabel is all about us growing and maturing and slowly learning more. Think of a student. As the student learns more, first you begin with Aleph Beis, then you learn a pasuk, a verse, then you learn how to read, and then you start learning as you grow from Ben Chamesh Mikra, Ben Eser Mishna, Ben Chamesh Eser Gemara, etc. We learned earlier, Mutfa Murgish Muskel. The Mekabel is retaining more and more light. So essentially, if you think of it that way, these three stages that we're talking about, these three forms of Ohr Mekabel are three stages. But we'll discuss this more later. I'm just saying it because it's important to keep in mind where he's going with all of this.
Actually, that makes sense.
Ultimately, the goal is that the Mekabel should receive more and more to the point that the eye will see that the eye will see without any external light, because it'll become so refined and so transformed that it itself will be able to see, which we're going to learn later about. So that's where we're going to head. But right now, we're not there yet. We learned it, but we'll learn it more in detail later. Now he's going to talk about what the difference between these three are in the context of Mikra, Mishna, and Talmud.
So the parallels of Beriya, Yetzira, and Asiya is Beriya is the first world where it's just the Evan. It's very limited. The Evan,
and Beriya is the moon. Beriya is the moon, not the Evan.
No, it's
Yetzira is the moon. Beriya is the moon.
Oh,
Ohr Halavana is Beriya, he said. Malchus Yetzira is like the Evan, and Malchus of Asiya is the Ayin. Moon, stone, eye. That's the order. But the explanation, you don't have to guess. He's going to explain it later. Okay. If you go back, if you go further, if you want to peek ahead, go ahead to page 1386, as I mentioned, where he goes back to this topic. Basically, the next almost 100 pages is going to be dedicated to this in one way or another.
Okay, I'll stick around.
A lot of details.
Thank you.
Okay. Are there any other questions? Okay. So now the Rebbe Rashab begins. V'yesh levayda inyan, 2 lines from the bottom of the page. V'yesh levayda inyan. We can explain this idea al pi hakdama hamavur b'makam acher, based on an introduction that's explained elsewhere. This elsewhere is another mimer called Inyam Mikra Mishna v'Talmud from the Tzemach Tzedek in Eretz Shavuos, which is based on Alter Rebbe's mimer that was said Shabbos Pasha Yisrei Tavkuf Ayin. Okay. Tavkuf Ayin would be 1820. I'm sorry, 1810. Is it 1810? Yeah, 1810. Yeah, the Alter Rebbe passed away in 1813. 1823. No, maybe 1820. 1820. 1810, yeah. So what does he say there? The Mashakosov, this what's explained elsewhere it explains a Pri Etz Chaim. But Mashakosov a Pri Etz Chaim Shar Hanhogas Halimut. Pri Etz Chaim is one of the Kisvei Arizal, written by Reb Chaim Vital, written down by Reb Chaim Vital. Pri Etz Chaim goes by the kavonis of the intentions of prayer and mitzvahs and so on. So Pri Etz Chaim Shar Hanhogas Halimud. It's a gate. Shar is a gate, a section in that sefer called Hanhogas Halimud, meaning how to learn. The Inya Mikra, Mishna, Talmud. So Pri Etz Chaim talks about Mikra, Mishna, Talmud, and this Maimer that we're just with Makamacha that he's going to explain now explains this Pri Etz Chaim. Mikra, Mishnah, Talmud are essentially the three main the three levels of structure of Torah. Mikra is Torah Shebiksav. That's why it's called Mikra, which we read and say Shnai Mikra. So Mikra is the verses of Torah Shebiksav. Mishna is the first stage of Torah Shebal Peh, compiled by Rabbi Yehuda Anossi, Rabbeinu HaKadosh, which is the Mishnah. And Talmud is the explanation of the Mishnah. So when you look in the Gemara, you'll see Mishnah is shorter sections written, taught by the Tanoim, and Talmud is the Amoraim, their students, several generations of students that elaborated and expounded on the Mishnah. So Mikra, Mishnah, Talmud are like three levels or three stages or three levels of learning Torah. Everything begins, of course, in the written Torah. Everything has to be based on the Chamishe Chumshe Torah or Tanakh in general is Mikra. And then you go to Mishnah and then Talmud. So these aren't just three different sections, they have different personalities. They're studied differently and they have different levels of authority. And he's going to explain now on a deeper level what is the difference essentially between the written and the oral Torah, and in the oral between Mishnah and Talmud. That's what we're going to learn now. And we're going to learn that later we're going to come back and say, and this will help us understand. This is the introduction the Rebbe Rashab wants to give us to help us understand these three levels of Ohr Mekabel. The three levels in Malchus of Beriya, Yetzira, Asiya that correspond to the examples of the moon, the stone, the luminous stone, and the eye, the eyesight. So it says like this in Pri Etz Chaim. The Talmud Beriya. The location of Talmud is in the world of Beriya. Mishna be Yetzira. Mishna is the world of Yetzira. Mikra, next page, 1365, Asiya. That's what it says in Pri Etz Chaim. I know it really jumps out at you. Shouldn't it be the other way? Mikra is higher than Talmud. So why is Mikra not Beriya? We'll get there. He's going to explain all this. All part of the explanation. But that's what the Pri Etz Chaim says. Talmud is in Beriya, which means Talmud corresponds to Malchus of Beriya, the moon. Mishnah, which corresponds to the luminous stone of Yetzira. And Mikra, which corresponds to the eye, is in Asiya, Malchus of Asiya. The Isa Pri Etz Chaim Sham, in that Pri Etz Chaim that we're citing here, he says, the Talmud Sheba Beriya, who Pirish HaMishnayis. We say Talmud in Beriya means the interpretation of Mishnayis. Because Talmud, a part of the Talmud, is interpreting the Mishnah. It takes a line from the Mishnah and elaborates on it. The Hamaso Matan Pilpul. Pirish HaMishnayis, Hamaso Matan Pilpul. And the Masa Matan Pilpul meaning the engagement and the pilpul in trying to analyze and evaluate and understand what the Mishnah is saying. That's what means Talmud Beriya. Aval hadinin shabta Talmud Beriya b'Pirish HaMishnayis. Aval hadinin shebet Talmud. V'shar ha'memres. But there's another part of Talmud that's not analyzing the Mishnah. The laws in the Talmud, there are actual laws that are established when the Amoraim are discussing, they come away with conclusions. The Shad HaMemes and the other statements or the other phrases that are she'enam pirush bir ala Mishnah, and they are not an explanation. They're not an explanation of the Mishnah. He says hein bechlal Mishnah. They are included in the level of Mishnah. So, in other words, the Talmud that we talk about Beriya is specifically the explanation, the interpretation and explanation of the Mishnah. But everything else is the category of Mishnah itself, not the category of Talmud. When we learned it the first time, I think I explained the reason for this. I don't remember now what I said, to be honest. I must have looked it up in p.1364. But what he's trying to say is, in other words, the level of Talmud that's explaining the Mishnah is so-called another level. But the other things that are in Talmud that are original statements from the Amoraim, the members, like he says, and the Dinim, that goes in the category of Mishnah because they're like a statement that is telling us what the halacha is. It's not analyzing something else. So we'll get back to, I think he's going to explain that later as well. There's parentheses, but that's what he says. Bisham, and he continues there, most likely in p.1364, that all these three levels that we're talking about, Beriya, Yetzira, Asiya, Talmud, Mishna, and Mikra, they're all on the level of nukva of Malchus. Raksha Talmud ubchinas Malchus de Beriya. So it's not just general Beriya, Yetzira, Asiya, but Talmud is the level of Malchus of Beriya. Mishna b'chinas Vav Ktsav is the Malchus, the Yetzira, and Mishna is the 6 facets of Malchus of Yetzira. That's why Mishnah has Shisha Sidre Mishnah. We'll learn that later as well. It has 6 sections, correspond to 6 facets of Malchus of Yetzira. And it doesn't say this explicitly, but most likely Mikra then would be Malchus of Asiya. Why he doesn't say it, I don't know. But he does say it about the first 2. Okay, fine. Now comes a question, or seemingly a contradiction of. He says like this: Isa, elsewhere says the Rebbe Rashab, says something very different. The Mikra, Mishnah, Talmud, the Mikra, Mishnah, and Talmud, hein Chabad, correspond to Chabad. Chochma Bina Das is Mikra. Chagas, Chesed Gvur Teferes is Mishnah, and Nehiel, Netzach, you say that Atzilus, all Natzilus, is Talmud. Hainu, this means that Mikra is Chabad Atzilus, Mishnah is Chagas, the Talmud Nehiel Atzilus. So here you see the exact opposite order. What's the highest? Chabad is higher than Chagas, and Chagas is higher than Nehiel. So one place, in p.1364, it says that Talmud is in Beriya, and Mishnah is in Yetzira, and Mikra is in Asiya. Or it says, more specific, Malchus of Beriya, Malchus of Yetzira, Malchus of Asiya. And elsewhere it says that Mikra is Chabad of Atzilus, and Mishnah is Chagas of Atzilus, and Talmud is Nehiel of Atzilus. So he doesn't say it like a question, he just says it as a statement, but very clearly that we need explanation. How do we reconcile this? And again, this is all Natzilus. And earlier we spoke about the 3 worlds, Beriya, Yetzira, Asiya. So all this is going to be explained now by the Rebbe Rashab in detail. But before we read on, because it's going to be a little dense, so far, so good. Anybody wants to ask anything to clarify what we just read? Okay. Acha inyan. Acha inyan clearly. So what's the inyan in this? However, the inyan in this is to explain all this. The Ne'isa Eitz Chaim, it says in Eitz Chaim, the b'chinas Chabad Chagas Nehi Klulim Gam Kem Miyud. That even though Chabad means the three cognitive faculties, Chachma, Bina, Das, Chagas is the three emotional or higher emotional faculties, Chesed, Gvur, Tiferes. Netzach, you say, is the more behavioral, lower level emotional faculties. Nevertheless, they all encompass all the 10 spheres. So this is a fundamental rule that we don't just have Chachma. Chachma also has within it Chachma within Chachma, Bina within Chachma, Das within Chachma, Chesed within Chachma, Gvura within Chachma. So basically, Chabad Chagas Nehi, Eitz Chaim says, has within it, is Klulim Miyud. They all have each other. The dominant faculty or attribute is Chabad, the three Chabad. But Chabad has in it also Chagas and Nehi. Chagas in his has Chabad and Nehi has Chabad and Chagas. So for example, when you're dealing with an emotion called, let's say, love. So love is primarily, it's love, but it's still driven by and contains within it some matter of intellect when you think of how to love someone. So it's true, you're not sitting at a book, at a sefer, learning and using your sheer cognitive brain power, but to say that emotions don't have any intelligence in them is not correct. Everything has, and the same thing when you're studying, there's also an emotional factor. You could separate them, but for being really functional, like in the human body, even though every organ and limb has its location and its function, but they interact with each other. And there's a certain overlap as they work and are coordinated with each other. Here it's even more so, it's a skalus. So that's number one that we need to know. V'hainu, and that means shebchinas Chabad yesh gam ken chagas shebechabad. That a Chabad there's a chagas shebechabad. So therefore, right here you see that in Chabad, which he called Mikra, there's a Chagas within that. The Nehisha b'Chabad, and it also has a Nehisha Chabad. So like in Mikra, there's a Mishna Sheba Mikra, and there's a Talmud Sheba Mikra, so to speak. Doesn't say that explicitly, but we'll learn that soon. B'chein b'Chagas, the same thing with Chagas, though it's emotions of Chesed, Gvura, Tiferes, Yesh Chabad, v'Nehi. It also encompasses within it the other two general categories. Umebchinas Nehisha b'Chabad, Nimshach Chabad shebenehi. It's another point that the Eitz Chaim makes. I think it's from the Eitz Chaim, but regardless, it may be from the Chassidus, that it's not just that they each encompass the other, it's the Nehi within Chabad that becomes the Chabad shebenehi. So he's going to explain it, but let me just give a few words about it so it shouldn't be completely confusing. Whenever two things interact, they're not just two separate entities interacting. They have to adjust themselves to each other. So in the Chassidus and Kabbalistic language, that's called the iskalulus. Just to give an example, when a wick and a flame come together, even though a wick on its own is just a piece of inorganic matter, and a flame is a light, nevertheless, they have to adjust to each other. They have to be tailored to each other. For example, a wick made out of, let's say, a piece of metal is not going to burn. A wick that is just a negligible thread is also going to burn out quickly. So the wick has to acclimate itself and be fitting for the keli. For the keli has to fit the oir, and the oir has to fit the keli. A big torch won't work with a little wick. Just an example Chassidus gives. The same idea, when Moichin gives birth to Midas, when you contemplate about something, so you're contemplating in an abstract way. And your mind tells you, this is a good thing. It's valuable. But you haven't yet said it's valuable for me. You come to understand this is a very precious thing. As long as you don't say it's valuable for me, it's not yet reached the level of emotion. Because emotion is already what is in it for me, my feeling about it. The mind, in its purest form, is an objective analyst. That's all it's meant to do. It's meant to process and not it can come to you with a conclusion. The mind can tell you, I did my research, and I'm telling you, it's worthwhile to invest in this. That's when the emotions kick in. But Chassidus explains that even when the mind is coming to a conclusion, there's the midah shebemeichin, the chagas shebechabad, which is not a full-blown feeling yet, but the mind is already beginning to come to a conclusion that this is something that is going to be worthwhile and good. That in turn will feed the chabas shebechagas, that intellectual conclusion will now enter into the heart, into the emotions, and guide them and say, I'm telling you, this is worthwhile for you to engage with, and that should be good for you, not just good in concept. So the idea here is that the midah shebemechin, chagas shebechabad, becomes the chabad shechagas. Here he's using the expression nehi shebechabad, nimshech chabad shebenehi. The same idea that in Chabad there's nehi, there's the behavioral netzach yesod, which are more behavioral emotions, more action-based. So they are encompassed within the mind, and that in turn informs the mind that then enters into nehi. Sometimes the expression you may find that gvura shebechesed will then become chesed shebegvura. But it's easier to understand it with the mind and emotions. The point being is that this is the iskalus shebenehi. Umenehi shebechagas nimshech chagas shebenehi. And the same idea, nehi, within the midas of chagas, from there will come the chagas shebenehi. So in other words, in addition to them all being all encompassing, all interconnected, they also interact with each other this way. So it's like the lower level of the higher level becomes the higher level of the lower level. And this is a common theme in science and so many other ways, where you find when you create, like I said, two entities or two ingredients interacting with each other, so there's a place where they meet. So the higher, the lower within the higher becomes the higher within the lower. Okay.
Can you give a scientific example like that?
I think almost every scientific experiment has elements of that. I'm thinking of a chemical reaction. Nothing comes to mind right now, but I give it some thought. Well, I know like this. The example I would give is more from engineering. That when, for example, let's take a light bulb. So a light bulb, the way it's produced, it's manufactured, it's interesting, and the truth is with all appliances, the electricity that flows into it is not flowing into the entire light bulb. It's flowing into the filaments that are very conducive to conduct and to generate and to draw and to carry electricity. If you just took, let's say, an object, take a stone, and you connect an electrical charge to it, the stone is not going to start shining suddenly. You have to have within the object something that's not quite electricity, but it's very receptive to it. It conducts it well. Then once that carries electricity into the appliance or into the light bulb, then the other parts of the light bulb begin to interact with that, and that triggers, well, in a light bulb, light. It triggers in a refrigeration.
The filament has within it Chabad, let's say, and the electricity
has within Chabad. It Chagas, yes, something like that. Yeah. Now, you open up a filament, you may not find electricity in it, but you'll find materials that are very that conduct electricity well. So it's like the keli within the oir is and that from the keli within the oir becomes the oir within the keli, if you want to put it that way. I mean, I don't want to go too far off the reservation. Here, the example is really about, like he says, Chagas, Chabad, Chagas, Nehi. In a healthy process of, that's why I gave the example more with research. Let's, for argument's sake, say you're in a business. There's a business meeting, and someone says, we have a proposal from a client or from another company. They want us to invest in them, or they want us to partner with us. Okay, so the first step is you send off people to do research and due diligence, right? That's Moichin, that's Chabad. You got to research it. We can't know, is it right for us, is it not? Find out all the pros and cons, and so on. The researchers come back. The next step is here's our conclusions. We come to that, here are the pros, here are the cons. Here's the chesed, here's the gvura, so to speak. Here's the reasons to go ahead with it, because it's good for us. That's like chesed. So the mind is coming now and coming to a conclusion and saying, after my independent and objective research, I've come to you could say, an inclination, which is called a midah, shebemechin, that this is right for us. Or, no, we should stay away, gvura, stay away from it. It's not for us. Or there's some positives and negatives. That still doesn't mean that you have a full-blown chesed and gvura because you haven't yet engaged. It's just the mind has come to that maskana. We're going to learn this later as well, I believe, how the mind works in that fashion. Then you move over to the midas. Okay, now that you've gone that stage, now the midas shebemoichin say, now we need another aspect of, I guess, due diligence to determine, are we going ahead with this or not? Which means, are we actually going to become a chesed? Is there going to be a real investment chesed, or we're going to stay away from it? I'm just using chesed and gvura as an example of either pro or con, just for practical purposes in this conversation. So now the midas are being informed by the mind. The meichin in the midas is being informed by the midas shebemeichin. And then you go to the next level, is nehi, is already actualization, where the midas are there and we're all excited. The board has voted. We're going to invest. We're all passionate about it. We're committed. We're going to engage. Whereas moichin is not engagement. Moichin is research. Nehi is actualization, where we actually are making a decision. We're signing today or whatever it is. You bring it into the behavioral so-called nehi of actualizing what the midas. So there again, there's the nehi sheb chagas, and there's the chagas and nehi. I mean, I can spell it out, but I think you can,
that's
from there,
good. Thank you.
already figure it out. Basically, a healthy process is not one of spontaneity that you just jump on a whim or onto intuition. It's a process where the first level does its job. It comes to some conclusions, and then that informs the next stage, and then the next stage. So it's like it's like an assembly line of a process, an assembly line of a process that moves along, but each step of the way encompasses the next step. I would give another example, which I think really works very well, but it's not literally so much to explain this. When you have a company with a hierarchy and you have different departments, so you have the CEO, okay? The heads of the departments answer to the CEO. The heads of the departments have people under them that answer to them. So the CEO has an intermediary. If he wants to get a message to the team, he calls in the head of the department. He talks to him. The head of the department then conveys the message. So bottom line is, you have here, always need, the CEO needs somebody to communicate from his perspective, from his vision, to the next level. So there's, so to speak, the head of the department is someone that the CEO identifies with. And then he can take what the CEO said to him to the next level. So it's an excellent way of delegation. Is essentially a good delegation is going to have. If there's any rift in this process, you're going to find problems. If the person who the CEO is speaking to, the head of the department, doesn't understand the CEO, or if the CEO spoke to someone on a lower level who doesn't get the picture, you're going to have a problem. So you need someone that is, we'll call it the head of the department within the CEO, becomes the CEO within the head of the department, if you understand what I'm saying. Anyway, these are some examples. It's basically a very thorough and meticulous approach to also problem solving, frankly. Because when you have a problem, you try to figure out where was the communication lost. What was it? Were the instructions not said right? Were the people who carried the instructions not said? In other words, you need to really keep it flowing in a very smooth way. And as you know, the game telephone, if you play telephone, usually there's going to be some problem because people misunderstand or don't know how to, I say something to you, if you're not the right Talmud, you're not going to give over what I said correctly. So that means you need the Talmud Shebe Rav and you need the Rav Shebe Talmud. I mean, going back to the example of Chazara that I always talk about, when we were absorbing what the Rebbe said, we were not the Rebbe, but we were becoming like completely absorbed the Mekabel within the Mashpia. And then the Mashpia can speak, the Mashpia in the Mekabel, that can then pass on to the next levels. Just some more examples for this. Okay. I hope that helped.
Yes, thank you very much.
Okay, let's stop here because I see already it's late. Okay, let's stop here. We're in the middle of the subject. I'm stopping literally in the middle of a sentence almost, but just because every line here has to be explained. So we'll stop here, top of page 1365. Are there any other questions? Okay, so